Hey everybody, let's talk Portuguese. Today is a long-awaited and a long-overdue video for this channel. I talk a lot about all of the different varieties of Portuguese here on my channel, but I have yet to make a video mentioning anything about the Portuguese spoken in Africa. So today, we're gonna do just that. But before we get started, if you're learning from my videos or find them interesting or just like them, support me on Patreon. On my Patreon, you can get exclusive access to what I'm working on first, reading lists based on the research that I do for all of my videos, and even fun things like postcards and other things that I send out directly from me to you. If that sounds interesting to you, check out my Patreon at the link in the description of all of my videos. Every little bit goes a long way to helping me make these videos for you. So to get started with today's video about African Portuguese, I wanted to talk a little bit about what exactly African Portuguese is and dispel a couple of the most common myths that I hear about it. First of all, when we're talking about African Portuguese, we are actually talking about the Portuguese spoken in Africa. This is because there are 5 countries in which Portuguese is spoken in Africa to different degrees. Africa, of course, is a very large continent, so of course these countries are pretty far from each other, and there is variation between how people speak in one country versus another. The 5 African countries in which Portuguese is spoken are Angola, Mozambique, São Tomé and Príncipe, Cabo Verde, and Guinea-Bissau. We will get into some country-specific details about the Portuguese spoken in those countries in just a moment, but before we get there, I wanted to talk about a couple of the misconceptions about African Portuguese that I see a lot. The first one is that African Portuguese is just the same thing as European Portuguese, with little to no differences between them. Now, it is true that European Portuguese serves as the normative basis for the Portuguese spoken in Africa, and this is because of the recent colonial history that led to Portuguese being more widely spoken on that continent in the first place. However, the reality of the Portuguese spoken in Africa is such that only a very tiny fraction of the elite of Portuguese speakers on the continent actually speak anything that resembles a normative European Portuguese. As with any variant of a language far separated from its source of origin, the Portuguese in Africa reflects certain characteristics of the Portuguese that arrived to it, as well as having undergone some changes and shifts as new speakers have adopted it and adapted the logic of their native language to the way they speak Portuguese. This is a natural process that occurs anywhere, and it is no less the case in any of the African countries in which Portuguese is spoken. The other big myth that I would like to dispel here is that African Portuguese is basically just Brazilian Portuguese, or that it is extremely similar to Brazilian Portuguese to the extent that they are almost the same thing. There are a lot of surface level similarities between African varieties of Portuguese and Brazilian Portuguese. However, those similarities are only surface level for reasons that we will get into later. The biggest overarching reason for this has to do with how Portuguese came to be in both Brazil and in African countries, however. In Brazil, Portuguese has about a 500-year history of adoption and use by locals as well as immigrants alike. Additionally, the adoption of Portuguese over time in Brazil was made a lot easier because of the reduction of the native populations of that country. That doesn't preclude Brazilian Portuguese from having quite a lot of indigenous influences, because it does, but the point remains that the local African populations in these countries were not reduced in the same manner, and they were not replaced or assimilated into a Portuguese-style culture. That, plus the difference of amount of time of the expansion of colonization in both places, means that African Portuguese has substantially different roots to it than Brazilian Portuguese itself does. So with that, let's briefly get into the history of Portuguese in Africa itself. Where Brazil has about 500 years of Portuguese shaping the linguistic and cultural landscape, Portuguese in Africa is a relatively recent phenomenon. The Portuguese would first land in Africa as part of the discoveries. Portugal historically was a maritime power that controlled trade routes from Europe to India and Asia by way of the route around Africa. This is the reason that Portuguese colonies were established along the coastline of Africa. Historically, there was quite a strong Portuguese presence in West Africa that would later extend to the southern portion of West Africa and indeed the eastern coast of Africa as well. The Portuguese were also the first to inhabit and colonize the islands of Cabo Verde and São Tomé and Príncipe. But for most of Portuguese colonial history, the colonies that the Portuguese had established on the African continent remained basically coastal settlements. The Portuguese would not come to control great swathes of land inland in Africa until the Great Scramble for Africa. Portugal, for its part, already had long-standing settlements in places like Luanda, which would serve as the basis for Portuguese Angola. The modern territories of Angola, Mozambique, and Guinea-Bissau are based on the territorial conquests of the Portuguese in this time period. So on the face of it, we have about 100 to 150 years of Portuguese being a little bit more widespread in Africa. But that doesn't paint the entire picture of linguistic expansion into Africa, because in Africa, of course, there already exists a plethora of languages and cultures and ethnic groups. Nowadays, European languages serve as common languages to unite different ethnic and linguistic groups in any given country, since the borders of African nations are not based along ethnic lines. But if that was the shortest summary of the Portuguese colonization of Africa possible, let's get into the overview of Portuguese in African countries as it stands nowadays. Portuguese-speaking African countries can basically be divided into two different types. There are the countries in which Portuguese-based Creole is in fact the common language, and there are the countries in which Portuguese is the common language. In the cases where Creole is the common language, what that means is that Portuguese-based Creoles over time developed into languages that people from different ethnic and linguistic backgrounds could use to communicate among themselves. In the modern nations of Guinea-Bissau, Cape Verde, and São Tomé and Príncipe, there exists to varying degrees a widespread dissemination of Portuguese-based Creoles. These Portuguese-based Creoles use mostly Portuguese words as the basis of their vocabulary, but their grammatical basis is a simplified Portuguese grammar with elements of African languages as well. Creole is most widely used in Guinea-Bissau and Cape Verde. Guinea-Bissau is a fairly interesting case. Creole is spoken by 80 to 90% of the population in that country, depending on the statistics that you use. That being said, statistics in that country are extremely unreliable, so there is no way of knowing the true number of speakers of any given language because the quality of institutions in that country is very low. This applies to the quality of education, which in Guinea-Bissau and pretty much any other African nation is the primary obstacle to furthering the advancement of the Portuguese language. Portuguese is the official language and the language used in government and media as well as education in Guinea-Bissau, but it is only spoken by 11 to 27% of the population, which is basically the elites of that country, depending on the data that you're using. Where educational attainment has been successful in that country, there exists a Creole spectrum. This Creole spectrum is basically to what extent the Creole spoken by those people comes to look like standard Portuguese or not. Notably as well, the Creole spoken in Guinea-Bissau has more African vocabulary than that which you would find in Cape Verde or São Tomé and Príncipe. The islands themselves are just as interesting. They are two sides of the same coin when it comes to linguistic usage. First, we have São Tomé and Príncipe, which is the country with the highest percentage of Portuguese speakers outside of Portugal and Brazil. In that country, 95% of the population speaks Portuguese, and about 50% of the population speaks Portuguese natively. Creoles are present in São Tomé and Príncipe, but they're not used in the same extensive manner as they are in Cabo Verde or Guinea-Bissau. Indeed, on some islands of São Tomé and Príncipe, Portuguese is taking over Creole as the language that young people are choosing to speak. The Portuguese spoken by the middle to lower classes in São Tomé and Príncipe is in fact a local vernacular of Portuguese with African influences and certain archaic features of Portuguese. This includes things like less vowel reduction in unstressed positions and a lot of African vocabulary. But that being said, the upper middle to upper classes in São Tomé and Príncipe speak a Portuguese that is basically standard European Portuguese. The main thing that distinguishes the Portuguese spoken by the elites of São Tomé and Príncipe from European Portuguese is in fact simply lexical influences. However, São Tomé and Príncipe is a very small country. It has about 200,000 people as its population, population. Simply put, there are too few speakers of Portuguese in São Tomé e Príncipe for it to be a major influence on Portuguese dialectology. But then we turn to Cabo Verde, which for historical reasons is a little bit different. The main language of the population of Cabo Verde is in fact Creole. Pretty much everybody in Cabo Verde speaks Creole as their native language. Creole is the common day-to-day language used in public and among the population of Cabo Verde, but Portuguese is the official language and the language used in media, in schools, as well as in government. Most of the population of Cabo Verde also speaks Portuguese, but they do so in that official capacity. This is one of the most classic and textbook examples of what is known in linguistics as diglossia. Diglossia is what happens when in any given region the general population uses one language for day-to-day affairs in casual and familiar settings, but uses a different language in formal or official contexts. Missionaries and religious bodies throughout colonial history across the globe would often teach the Bible and Christianity to local populations in their own language. What went along with that was increased literacy and a general education of that population. This was no different in the local population of Cabo Verde, and it was from there that Creole took hold because it was used as the common language of communication for that purpose. But let's move on to the other category of Portuguese-speaking African countries. I'm talking about the countries in which Portuguese is in fact the common language. Those two countries are Angola and Mozambique, and linguistically speaking, they are fairly similar. They are both countries in which Bantu languages are the languages that are spoken by the majority of the population. Bantu languages are the largest and most common family of languages spoken in sub-Saharan Africa. In both countries, the usage of Portuguese is conditioned by urbanization. The more the population of each country moves to cities, the more likely they are to speak Portuguese. It is for that reason that Angola is in fact the true source of rooted Portuguese in Africa. Angola has the largest percentage of Portuguese spoken at home of any African nation. 71% of the population of Angola speaks Portuguese and speaks it at home, whether they are native or second language speakers. That is a very significant statistic. What it means is that there are quite a lot of people in Angola who come to adopt Portuguese as their day-to-day life, whether or not they come from a Portuguese linguistic background. This is the fundamental way in which language shift occurs anywhere, but it is especially true in these countries. Mozambique, for its part, is less highly urbanized and therefore does not have the same widespread diffusion of Portuguese as the common language. That being said, in recent decades, the number of Portuguese speakers has only continued to go up in that country as urbanization spreads. About half of the population of Mozambique speak Portuguese in some capacity, and about 16% of that population speaks it natively. That is especially true in the capital Maputo and other cities like Beira, and it will continue to be the case as Mozambique urbanizes and grows further. But in the case of both Angola and Mozambique, rural areas are where Portuguese is used the least. This is down to two main factors. The first and most obvious factor is that in rural areas in these countries, ethnic and linguistic groups are generally in much less contact with each other. Because different groups speaking different languages are not coming together as frequently, they have a much lesser need for intercommunication, which would require the use of a different language so that they could understand themselves. Therefore, Portuguese is not turned to as a means of communication among groups the same way that it is used in cities where lots of different people from lots of different ethnic and linguistic backgrounds come together in one place. But the other main reason why Portuguese is not widespread in rural areas in Angola and Mozambique, and even Guinea-Bissau, is because the quality of education in those countries is at its worst in rural areas. If the quality and standards of education in these countries is not especially high to begin with, and it is one of the major challenges that they face as countries in terms of development, this is especially true in rural areas. If the quality of education in Portuguese is not sufficient, people who have no other reason to speak Portuguese in those areas will not even learn the language adequately to be able to express themselves in it. And that turns out to be the case by and large in those countries. Angola is the African country most likely to develop its own standard of Portuguese as opposed to Brazilian or European Portuguese due to its larger population adoption and deeper penetration of the Portuguese language among the population. Mozambique, for its part, is home to the famous author Mia Couto. Although Mia Couto is ethnically Portuguese and was born to Portuguese parents, he was born and raised in Mozambique and chose to stay in Mozambique after its independence from Portugal. Today, Mia Couto is one of the most highly celebrated authors in the Lusophonia, and he can be seen as something of a standard setter for Mozambican Portuguese in literature, if not African Portuguese in general. His works are very well known for infusing local words, proverbs, metaphors, and other linguistic elements into his writing. So now that we have a little bit of an idea of the background of Portuguese in these countries, let's take a little bit of a look at how Portuguese functions in African countries. There are about 30 million speakers of Portuguese in Africa as a whole. The overwhelming majority of these speakers of Portuguese speak it as a second language. The greatest number of speakers are of course in Angola with 18.5 million speakers and Mozambique with about 10.5 million speakers. To put that into perspective, Angola has about 1 2/3 times the amount of Portuguese speakers as Portugal, and Mozambique has about the same number of Portuguese speakers as Portugal. From a general perspective, the basis of the normative standard of Portuguese in Africa is indeed European Portuguese. However, there are certain common characteristics to the Portuguese spoken in all of these countries. Lessened vowel reduction of unstressed vowels is extremely common in African countries. This has two main reasons behind it. The first of which has to do with when Portuguese settlers first arrived in any given territory. The older the Portuguese settlements, the less likely the Portuguese in any given place is to have that extra reduction of vowel structure. This will make sense if you go back to the video that I did about the evolution of European Portuguese, in which I talk about when and how the further reduction of unstressed vowels happened in Portugal. It is also universal to African countries that those countries have a significant influence of African vocabulary. The lexicon in Portuguese in all of those countries has a very large African language contribution to it. And in fact, quite a lot of that vocabulary has made its way to Portugal and Brazil themselves. Words with African etymologies feature very frequently in both Portugal and Brazil. These can be technical terms as well as slang. If you've ever heard a Portuguese person use the term bué, then you're hearing an African word. The same thing applies to the uses of bazar or vazar in Brazil, and a whole host of other lexical items. With that being said, the grammar of Portuguese is also affected by local African languages. The grammar of the Portuguese spoken by the general populations of Mozambique and Angola is fairly similar due to fairly similar grammatical structures coming from the Bantu languages that they speak. Those languages have very different grammatical structures to the European Romance languages that we're familiar with. This is especially true of the particles and position thereof that they use for the grammatical function of a pronoun. One of the most common things that you will see in speakers from both Mozambique and Angola is an intermixing of the pronouns tu and você and their respective conjugation. This is down to how formality and pronouns work in their local languages, and it also has an impact on the pronoun placement that they use as well. In Angola, for example, the pronoun particle is in a fixed position, and this is usually before a verb. So speakers of Angolan Portuguese are often inclined to procles in cases where encles would be the normative standard in Europe. But they will also often split those positions up almost at random. One very interesting systematic development of pronoun placement is the usage of encles in positions where in European Portuguese a word is present that would attract the pronoun to the front, or in other words, make procles a necessity. So after words like que, para, todo, and so on, you will often see encles in the speech of both Angolans and Mozambicans. Similarly, lleísmo is also a fairly common phenomenon. Lleísmo is the use of lhe in the place of all weaker third-person pronouns. This is to say that lhe takes the position of u, a, and so on. So where in European Portuguese you might say viu to mean I saw him, many speakers of Portuguese in Angola and Mozambique would see lhe vi or vi yeah. To round out some of the grammatical quirks of African varieties of Portuguese, especially those spoken in Angola and Mozambique, there is a tendency among Angolan and Mozambican speakers to say para mim with the infinitive, where in standard Portuguese we would say para eu. So for example, if you were to say para eu fazer, many Angolan and Mozambican speakers would say para mim fazer. In all of these cases, the origin of these grammatical quirks or mistakes is due to the influence of Bantu languages on speakers of Portuguese as a second language. When people learn a second language past childhood, they will invariably apply their native language's logic to that language, and so that's how we end up with grammatical structures like this. Despite the superficial similarities with Brazilian Portuguese and the widespread availability of Brazilian media in these countries, these characteristics have not come about as a result of contact with Brazilian Portuguese. But I dare say that's quite a lot of information for one video. If you'd like me to go into greater detail about characteristics of African Portuguese such as phonetics or grammar, let me know in a comment down below. But for now, that's all I've got for this video. I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you did, if you learned something or otherwise found it interesting, give me a thumbs up down below. You might think about subscribing to my channel if you're not already. I have a ton of videos dedicated to the Portuguese language. You can find those videos on my channel or on the eye above, and I will see you next time.